Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello, and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today, I'm excited to talk to James Latwell about his latest book in the Nathan Parker series, Served Cold. Show us that cover, Jim.
Good morning, Dan. How are you? Served Cold, yeah.
It is beautiful. I love that. So in Nathan Parker, you set a series in southern Arizona, or at least in Maricopa County. Give the audience a reason or an idea of what the story's about and why is it set there?
Yeah, the story, actually the whole series, Nathan Parker series, deals with immigration issues, border violence, and who's really caught in that struggle. And it might not be who you really think it might be. So my main character, Nathan Parker, is a detective in Maricopa County, and he's immersed in that world. The series kind of sparked from a couple of events I had when I was still working in the prison system. And there's a prison near San Diego, and I was sent there to do with a team, and we were doing a security audit on the prison. It's an annual thing that we go in and review all the protocols and that kind of thing. Usually things are squared away, everything's very calm, but I walked into the prison and it's just this frantic, anxiety-ridden thing. Something's up, and we finally found out that they couldn't clear their count. Now, in a prison, the one thing you do is know how many inmates you have. That's the count. And they narrowed it down after a while and determined that the minimum facility, the one that's just outside the walls, they couldn't clear that count. So something was wrong. So they actually went into that dormitory of 250, bunks, bunk by bunk, with a photo and see who was in the bed. And they found out they had one more inmate than they were supposed to have.
Not one less, but one more.
Yeah. One more inmate than we're supposed to have. But what it turned out to be is there are migrant trails from the border. You can see the border from the main yard. And the migrants would use the trails to go north past the prison and on northward. A guy got so tired, hungry, and cold that breaking into prison for a place to stay was a good idea. So that kind of stuck with me for a while, that, if someone was that desperate, what would they do? In another incident, I was a juvenile court referee, and that's basically where you adjudicate, minor violations, decide who's going to go to juvenile hall, that kind of thing. And this mom and her daughter came in, and the first thing mom did was hand me and her daughter their green cards. And it's like she knew, because her daughter had shoplifted, that I was going to deport them and send them back home. And we didn't do that. It was just kind of a counsel reprimand and, don't do this anymore. The girl was quite contrite about it. But the feeling that status was so fragile, that at any time your life could be just ripped out from under you and you'd be, thrown back to somewhere where you didn't have any ties at all. Those two incidents stuck with me, and that's kind of the underpinnings of this series.
It's interesting because you treat it with a lot of delicacy. And I know that probably sounds like an unusual word, but you're very respectful of all of your characters and where they are in their lane. And I think as a reader, that's very important to me. I don't need someone to preach to me. You definitely don't do that. I mean, I feel like I'm quasi-informed. If I need to know something, I certainly don't watch the news to figure out what it is. I do a little deep dive on it to figure out what's going on. And it is a really tough thing. I have a long-term friend who's been in this country for, I think, 24 or 25 years, and he's here on a work visa. But he's every 2 years, I think he has to have it renewed. And it's an enormous amount of hoops you have to jump through. And something as simple as getting the real ID, a lot of states you can't fly to anymore without a real ID. So when he got a real ID, it actually screwed with his status on being an immigrant. And no one knew it would happen. He was just told, you have to get this real ID. And when it did, it threw his work status visa into jeopardy. And that took about 6 months of, I mean, heartbreak and agony. And I think
I bet.
we see so much on the news about how people would like to paint immigrants. And we're told immigrants do X, Y, Z. And it may or may not be the truth. And it's sad. I think at the heart and the root of it, these are human beings. One way or another, they're still human beings. And if you break into a prison because you're cold and hungry, that does go to show a desperation.
It does. It really does. And thank you for saying that you think it's handled delicately, because I've really tried to do that. I mean, this is a very hot political issue now. I didn't write it thinking that it would be that, but the publishing business as it is, the timing, here we are. But yeah, I try not to preach. I kind of give both perspectives of the issue. You know, what a very conservative, right-leaning cop would think, and then what the migrants are going through and those who support them are going through, and let the reader make up their own mind. Readers are smart.
Absolutely.
And they can kind of parse out what's really happening out there in the world.
Yes, and if they pick up your book, they're looking for a story that they're already attracted to, because all readers get to read the little blurb on the back of the book or something online. So I think if they pick up Served Cold, they're looking for this particular issue to read about.
Yeah.
And another thing I'll pat you on the back about is I love Nathan's team. So conflict happens. Conflict has to happen in a mystery because it moves the story along. But Nathan's team is not the conflict. What's going on outside of his team is the conflict. And that's a look, I don't mind reading a bad cop or a really bad criminal story. I mean, as long as it's a great story, I'm into it. But I was really impressed about Nathan's team. They're a cohesive team who work together to move the ball forward. How important to you was that?
I think Dead Drop was the first in the series, and once I got that core team established of who would be in his world, it kind of opened up the series to me. Like, there's a whole lot of territory here. I mean, it's an unusual team. It's not just a buddy cop drama.
Right.
But yeah, one of his main sidekicks is Billy Carson, and Billy is a reformed smuggler. She used to smuggle, immigrants over the border, got in trouble with the cartel and went into witness protection, and she's living off the grid because of that. In Served Cold, we learn a little bit more about her background, but it just is this other rich environment to kind of draw from and give some texture to that immigrant story that we're talking about, and also the struggles that Parker's going through in his life, and how they come together.
So the mention of living off the grid, I think that's something people have heard. That little phrase, living off the grid, I think people would be shocked in real life to learn that there are large encampments of off the grid people along the southern border. And they're not immigrants. They're mostly people, U.S. citizens, who choose to live off the grid. There's a place outside of El Centro here in California it's an entire city that is off the grid. No electricity, no running water, none of that. But yet there are thousands of people that live there. And I will say that there are not very many things that frighten me in this world, but to be dropped off on an off the grid area would frighten me, because I'd be out of my element. Where would I plug in my hair dryer? I mean, come on now, we have to be real about life.
Yeah, I mean, everybody has their own reasons for wanting to disconnect.
Yes.
I mean,
yes, absolutely.
Even up here in Northern California, where I'm at, there's a community that's not far away. It's in the heavily forested, national forest area, and they're off the grid, and that's what they want to be. They just want to be isolated, left alone, not touched by, Sacramento politics and all that kind of stuff. They just want to be left alone. Now, sometimes that can get a little fringy,
Yes.
with some elements, but that's another story we'll get to later.
Well, and maybe, Jim, I'm a little jealous or envious of people who can live off of the grid, because they're not reliant on everyone else's opinion, because they have already
Yeah.
made up their mind that they have the opinion they want, and they want no outside influence. So maybe I'm a little jealous. I don't know. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, part of it does have an attraction. It's like going off to a, all-inclusive resort with absolutely no amenities. There's nothing there. But yeah.
So, all right. So you have a series that is set in
Yep.
in and around Phoenix. You have one set in Sacramento, and when I last saw you, I said I would mention this because so I looked up statistics. Sacramento has a little more than 500,000 citizens. Phoenix has a little more than 1.5 million, and yet when I visited both cities, in a lot of ways, I feel like Phoenix is smaller. There's a lot of urban sprawl. It's like Los Angeles. It spreads out, but it has this unique, almost small town feel, almost rural feel in it to me. So how did you approach the series in Sacramento versus the series in Phoenix?
I done something really, really well there that, Phoenix, although it's like the fifth or sixth largest city in the country, it's so sprawled out, and it's overly vibrant kind of feel, and they kind of just keep to themselves. And in Served Cold, we talk about some of those communities in La Mirage and Guadalupe where, immigrants kind of congregate. They feel safe there together. They kind of protect one another. And we kind of use that in Served Cold. The book's set in Sacramento, the Emily Hunter series. Different feel completely. And you're right. I get more of a city feel in an urban environment in Sacramento than I do in Phoenix, even in downtown Phoenix. And I think that helps me kind of compartmentalize when I write the two, because they feel different. The tone is different. Protagonists are different. So I can kind of separate, at least in my mind, when I write those two worlds and those two characters.
So there's something about the desert that reminds me of the far north where there's a lot of snow. There are these elements that are so polarized, right? So the desert is dry and you can taste it. If you're in Phoenix, you can taste Phoenix just because it's dry and it's dusty and there's sand and stuff. So is that something that's intriguing to you?
It is. I mean, that's one of the things that drew me to writing a series set in that place, was because of that environment. I mean, it almost becomes another character where, even the migrants or the police who are trying to enforce border law, they're faced with that too, and it's a struggle. The monsoons that come through there every year. If you've ever seen one of those or been in one, they're awesome. I mean, it's just like you can't do anything. You can't go outside. You're stuck, and wait till this blows over. So if you're out on the trails when one of those comes through, that's life threatening.
Yes,
So
you better seek high ground because it won't play with you.
It won't.
When the water runs in the desert, there is no I will withstand this, because the current is just so intense.
Yeah, the flash floods are just, and they're quick, and they're just super dangerous down there.
So now I always have to have at least one screwball question. So now you've given Nathan a current girlfriend named Linda and an ex-girlfriend named Lynette. So when you're typing, do you get them confused, or do you have to have like a running sheet there? Because those names are very similar, Jim.
They're very similar, and it's intentional. And I'll give you a kind of a clue. In the next book in the series that I just finished drafting, his current girlfriend Linda and he are having an argument, and he calls her Lynette. So you can imagine the sparks that fly with that. So it was intentional. I was just waiting for the right moment to throw that in there. And there's a big reveal in that relationship coming in book 4.
So you also give us a whole lot of humanity in both Nathan and Linda, in the fact that they have adopted children. Right. And how was that for you? Was that an important element in the story? Because I think we see something different, or this reader sees something different, and it was so impressive.
Oh, thank you. It's one of the things that I think people have talked about most about the series, and starting with Dead Drop, was the relationship between Nathan and Miguel, the El Salvadoran kid that he kind of befriended on the trail and later, became his foster parent. Um, it gave Nathan this other side to kind of explore, this parental side that he never had before. And it also was a reminder that to him that as screwed up as he thinks his life is, imagine what Miguel's gone through. And this kid is resilient, and he's bright and smart, and yeah, he's a survivor. And I think Nathan has learned probably more from him than Miguel did from Nathan.
And I think that's a beautiful thing. It just goes to show your humanity as a human and as an author, that you've brought in something that, as we talked about before we started recording, I think every author is political one way or another. Writing is politics, and it, as I said earlier, you don't preach to us. You don't say you must think this or you must think that. But I think all of life is political. And in this instance, you've given Nathan such a humanity by, hooking up with Miguel and fostering Miguel. And as you say, Miguel is so bright, and you've written him so magically that you want, I think every reader will always root for Miguel no matter what he does in life.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, he was kind of a character that, as the drafting the first couple of books in the series, there's more to Miguel that I want to explore, and I think he could really kind of enrich, Nathan's life as he goes on, and I think he has already.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my favorite character besides Nathan is Billy. Billy she's different, and she's a bit of a renegade, maybe an
Yep.
aging hippie, but very sure of her values and where her lane is. And that was fun to read. Was it really, really fun to write?
She is a blast to write because she's so. I mean, she has no filters at all. She'll tell you what she's thinking, and yeah, I mean, she just wears everything out on her sleeve. But I'll let you in on a little secret here. When I first wrote Billy's character, um, she was a man.
Oh,
That
okay.
that character was male, and through the revisions and everything, it's just like, what? What if we turn this on its head and put this lone renegade woman in this role? And that made a huge difference. The dynamic between Parker and Billy then changed, and you can see where that's gone in the series, especially with Served Cold, where we discover a lot more about Billy's background and secrets that she had in her past.
I love that. And I'm sure I would have loved to read, because I enjoy your work. I would have loved to read Billy as a man, but I'm so glad Billy's a woman, because I think there
Yeah,
are things that you can give a female voice in her character that you probably couldn't flesh out as well as a man. And I hope that's not offensive. It's just one of those things. I think as a female, the character works so much better because she's vulnerable in places that a man might not be vulnerable, but yet she's so
yeah,
sure of herself where she is in her life. And that's a great thing to read.
yeah, and it's exactly that. I think Billy has an additional layer of vulnerability that people will look at her and think and make perceptions of her because she's a woman off the grid, living on her own. And she's a lot stronger than she looks, and she kind of keeps a lot of that inside. But yeah, she's a blast to write. She's one of my favorite characters.
And it's one of those things that I think the reader will go along with Billy, whatever life choices she makes, because you've given us a character that's so fully formed in
Mm.
her belief. And so that's wonderful. So what are you working on now? Because I know you personally, and I know you probably got 18 books in the closet just waiting to be dusted off and sent out. So where are we now? So you already have the one for January's finished, right?
Yes, yeah. River of Lies is the second book in the Emily Hunter series that's coming out in January. River of Lies features Detective Hunter. She's investigating a series of arson fires in the homeless camps in Sacramento, and she discovers even the homeless have something that somebody wants.
Yes.
And then book 4 in Nathan Parker's series, the follow up to Served Cold, comes out in July, and so far it's titled Sins of the Fathers.
I love
That'll
that
be
title. I love that
that'll be
title.
fun.
Do
Good.
you and Anne Marie get a chance to go on vacation or never? Or
Occasionally, yeah, it's with the plot hounds here that are now very nicely sleeping here listening to us. It's difficult to get the board and care setups for that, but I think we're going to be getting out of town next month and doing some California North Coast kind of things and
nice,
taking the dogs along with us.
nice. That's so wonderful. Thank you, Jim, for joining me. Show us the cover again, please. It's
Yep,
served
serve cold.
cold and it's out now. I highly
Yes.
recommend it. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dan. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at outwithdan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.